So, good afternoon, Rotarians and guests. And my name is Sandra Hills, and I am your MC for today. And we also have some people online, which is fantastic. I'm not quite sure how many, but I shall be informed of that in due course. We would like to acknowledge that we are today meeting on the lands of the Bunurong people, the people of the Kulin Nation, and those people who are online may actually be meeting on other lands as well. But we would like to pay our respects to elders past, present and future, and extend that respect to all First Nations people who may be present today at our meeting. So welcome to our hybrid meeting to those online and in the room. And thanks today will be given by Peter Dakin, followed by the Loyal Toast presented by President Reg. So please ensure that you've got something in your glass. Enjoy your meeting, everyone. Here comes Peter. I'll go this way.
Thank you, Sandra, very much. Okay, good to be back at the Sofitel again. Well, good afternoon, Rotarians and guests present here today and online, and some fellow Melbourne supporters are here today too. We're looking good. Now, I'm prompted today to reflect back on the terrific 34-year journey I've been on since joining our great club in 1988. The ideals of service and commitment from hundreds of our current and past members involved in an extraordinary range of community projects has been outstanding and inspirational. Above all, however, I feel what has been critical to the success of our club has been the fun and fellowship generated amongst our membership through personal interaction at lunches, group meetings, club projects and activities. Like so many organisations, our club has been decimated by the ongoing impact of COVID in terms of numbers, attendance at functions, and the wonderful camaraderie that has existed for a century with the Rotary Club of Melbourne. The time has come for those of us who remain dedicated to the club to rally and support the President, office bearers, and of course, Joe in the office, to reignite the fun and fellowship we so much enjoy. It will be critical to our club's future success that we can grow our membership again, meet in groups, which I'm a great supporter of, ideally with our partners, and make every effort to do this over the remaining 3 months of this Rotary year. That's all that's left. Our member being awarded a Paul Harris Fellowship today is a super salesperson who epitomises what having fun and fellowship is all about. Thank you, and over to you, Reg.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, and thanks particularly for your appeal there. I'd like to propose a toast, Rotarians and guests, a toast to Australia and Rotary International. Australia, Rotary International. Thanks, everyone. Please be seated. We will be breaking now to for our meal break, and for those online, we'll be back at around about 1 o'clock. And so I implore everyone enjoy, and we'll kick the meeting off shortly. Thank you. Members, visitors and guests, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our 34th meeting of the Rotary year, of this Rotary year, and our 4,930th club meeting in our 101st year. Wonderful to see you all here today, truly wonderful. And I'm delighted to foreshadow that Trevor Jensen, a pretty learned civil aviation consultant with a great deal of experience, which I've been part of, he'll be speaking on the future of aviation, and will be further introduced by Chair of the Day, Adrian Nelson. Also here as my guest is a well-known pilot, who's a former pilot who's well known to us, James Nixon, the brother of Rosemary Nixon. As a guest of the club today, we have Rotarian Alan Trumbull, and we will hear from Alan shortly as he is honoured and named a Paul Harris Fellow by the club today. And please, we've also got with the club a guest with Bob Fells from our Rotary Foundation Committee, and it's a Peace Fellow candidate, or a Global Scholarship candidate, I should say, Hannah Gandhi. Please join me in acknowledging and making these guests welcome. We have some visiting, have one visiting Rotarian, and we have some guests of members. If we could just withhold applause until I've introduced each. Firstly, we have an international visitor from Switzerland, Andrea Gutowski from Lausanne, and guests of Rotarians. We have Rebecca Nojdowski, who's a guest of David Cram, and I'd like you all to stand, please, and we'll welcome you. Thank you. Okay, so the first item of business today is to introduce Alan Trumbull and take you through the presentation of his Paul Harris Fellow. And let me give you some background. The Paul Harris Fellow is named after Paul Harris, who founded Rotary with 3 business associates in Chicago in 1905, and was established. And the foundation and this fellowship has been established in his honour in 1957 to support humanitarian and educational programs of the Rotary Foundation, which are funded and implemented and managed by Rotarians and Rotary clubs around the world. A donation of $1,000 US is made in the name of the recipient of the fellowship. It is a tradition of this club that the naming of a Paul Harris Fellow is based upon the contribution individual members and deserving members of the community who practice the Rotary motto, service above self, are rewarded in this way and recognised in this way. Today, we recognise the efforts of Alan Trumbull. And a bit from the citation, and Alan, I might ask you to come forward. We'll be publishing Alan's citation in the bulletin next week, but probably the most useful snippet from the citation is Alan's wry humour and genuine nature has benefited our club as he has cajoled and persuaded members to part with their money, time, and even their seat on occasions at luncheons. His interest in fellowship was exemplified by his membership in reception with lunch setup, group captaincy, and the fundraising committee. Alan, please come forward to the podium. Thank you. I am delighted to present to you the citation, and of course the Paul Harris pin that goes with that. Now I'll be guardian of these for you while you address us, Alan. A few words, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, President Reg. Rotarians and guests, especially my fellow Rotarians, you were very kind to honour me with this Paul Harris Award, which when I feel there are so many dedicated people and Rotarians far more deserving than me. Perhaps coming from a small business background, I unashamedly cherry-picked what I like to do from the many opportunities Rotary offers, and avoided committee involvement like the plague. I do somewhat regret this, but I thoroughly appreciated and enjoyed the many fruits I was able to pick. As a later life starter in Rotary, I was intrigued with the vibe and the involvement of our members in the Rotary Club of Melbourne. Peter referred to it just a little while ago. The many friendships and acquaintances I developed, together with the wonderful, stimulating opportunities to be involved and a participant, are very, very rewarding. In a discussion with my nominator many years ago, Russ Lego, and the inspiring David Whitner, when I was offered the opportunity to join, I was impressed with the sound wisdom embodied in the four-way test as a very worthwhile aim in life. Plus, it stressed there was no overt political or religious causes tolerated in our activities. Regrettably, in the year preceding Reg's presidency, certainly in my opinion anyway, we seem to lose sight of this wonderful guideline. And in a rush of ambitious people for change, for change's sake, and perhaps personal ambition by using Rotary as a stepping stone. Undoubtedly, some change was needed for us to stay in touch with current community expectations and development, but surely not with the damage and harm being done to the Rotary Club of Melbourne culture and history. Fortunately, the very structure of Rotary adjusted and coped with the errant behaviour, and it is to the great credit of President Reg and his board that the Rotary Club of Melbourne is in a strong recovery and rebuilding mode, nurtured and supported by you, its many contributing and active members. If you will indulge me for another moment, 1 minute, I would like to reflect for a moment on two reasonably recent events that caused me considerable sadness. One was that David Whitner, Rotarian par excellence, did not see the club he cherished turn 100. And the other is the loss of a wonderful character and personality in David Freeze, departing before his beloved demons achieved his dream. They, as so many others, play an important part in what I cherish about this club. I enjoy being a Rotarian, even if these days I am not participating very much. And I am confident the Rotary Club of Melbourne will continue to thrive and grow as President Reg hands over the baton to incoming President Bev Brock later in the year. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much again, Alan, and congratulations on this recognition. Please accept the pin and the citation, and I think we now have a photo opportunity. So let's step to the left here, and
Over here.
Yep, thank you. Ian will get us set up. Thanks very much, everybody. I'd now like to invite our District Governor-elect, our very own Melbourne Rotarian, Mandy Wendt, to step up to the podium and tell us a few words, give us an update on planning for next year's activities at District. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you very much, Reg. Now, I know that you've heard me say this quite a lot, and that it is always a really great time to join Rotary. Well, I want to say it's a really, really great time to join it right now. So as we've just been reflecting on our centenary celebrations over the last 2 years and the enviable legacy of not just this club, but Rotary in Victoria, to now looking to the future next year, where we're about to welcome 25,000 of our friends through the Rotary International Convention. This is all happening at a time where in the last 2 years, people have had to connect with their communities in ways that they've never done before. We've got so many stories of people who all of a sudden know who their neighbours are. They know their names. They've had to look out for them in new ways, and they've created in many areas a sense of community that's never been there before. And I think this is a terrific thing for us in Rotary, because these people don't want to lose that sense of community. If anything, they want to keep building on it. We're already seeing as well, I've got to say, in Rotary around the district, I have to say a restlessness amongst Rotarians and their partners to just get back out there and do hands-on service. And the statistics are still continuously telling us that there are 6 million people across Australia who volunteer each year. And the largest demographic of those volunteers are people within the 30 to 45-year-old demographic. So these are people who are passionate about the environment, equity, and who literally want to go and get their hands dirty. And that's a huge number of people who share the same values as every single person in this room. And together over the coming 15 months, we can tap into this to build stronger projects, stronger partnerships, and ultimately stronger communities. Now, in January, the Rotary International President-elect Jennifer Jones announced the theme for 22-23. And can I say, it couldn't be more fitting, especially for Rotarians in our district. As one of the best calls to action, Jennifer is emboldening us to imagine Rotary and what's possible for our clubs, our communities, and for ourselves. Now, the logo, I'm sure most of you have probably seen it by now, but just in case you don't know, that logo has a very special connection to us here in District 9800. It's not a typical presidential theme logo, and it was actually designed by Indigenous Australian artist Ricky Salem in celebration of the Melbourne International Convention. And as you would expect from our dynamic incoming international president-elect, it's packed with symbolism. I like to say it's very Jennifer, but it's also very us for 22-23. Now, just quickly, in the last few months, literally in the last 2 months alone, the 22-23 district team have delivered a 2-day in-person President's Capability Weekend for about 75 people. We've had a 2-day online conference for 300 incoming leaders, hosted for the very first time by all of the Victorian and Tasmanian governor-elects. We've also held a district leadership strategy session. We've held assistant governor training sessions, and we've still got another PETS and district assembly to go. So yeah, it's been a little busy this year. Our greenhouse platform that I've mentioned in an update before, which we launched in August, where incoming leaders are sharing ideas and collaborating, has now gone global. It continues to grow, and that's something that I'm incredibly proud of as a very, say, early win in the journey towards 22-23. The biggest piece of advice that I received very early on in my journey was to make sure that I got the right team. And I'm so incredibly lucky to be surrounded by just some amazing Rotarians. And there's a huge diversity across many dimensions, with everyone bringing a very fresh, professional and modern approach to how we go about doing Rotary business. And I know he's not here today, but I do want to give a very special shout out to David Carruthers. He was my very first team pick about 2 years ago. I made sure I got in really early with that one. He is the incoming district treasurer and just recently led the most seamless board approval process for a district budget that I've actually ever witnessed. So I'm really thankful to David for his time and talents, and of course for his sense of humour. Finally, I do look forward to seeing you all at the District Changeover lunch on Saturday, the 25th of June, which is being held at Hyatt Essendon Fields. This year, it is a Melbourne-hosted event because of you being the home of the incoming district governor. And this is a time for hundreds of Rotarians and friends from across our district to celebrate the achievements of this year and to welcome in the new team and direction. As we know, it is going to be a huge year for our club next year. And I very much look forward to your support at that event as I start my role as District Governor. So thank you, Reg, for the opportunity to update everyone today. Thanks.
Okay, just a couple more formalities. Firstly, the much sought after raffle. A pretty useful local drop, a Shadow to Bill Shiraz 2018. And for efficiency's sake, I'll draw. And I can assure you I have no vested interest. Okay, it's an orange ticket and numbered A25. Close. Oh dear, I said I didn't have. Are we going to have a redraw soon? Okay, it now gives me great pleasure to invite Adrian Nelson to the podium to introduce our guest speaker, an old buddy of mine from Ansett, Trevor Jensen. Adrian, over to you.
Thank you, President Reg. To our auditors for the raffle, hopefully you'll certainly apply your skills very shortly. Rotarians and guests. My first time in a cockpit was on an Ansett flight from Melbourne to Coolangatta when I was aged 4, when the flight attendants would come down the aisles and see if there are any young children who'd like to see what happens at the front of the plane. So I walked up and saw the most amazing blue skies, white clouds underneath, and was proudly given the little Ansett wings to pin on my t-shirt. The last time I was in a cockpit was year 2000, which was on a British Airways flight from London to Oslo, when the 4-year-old inside me sort of asked the flight attendant, look, is there any chance of getting up into the cockpit to see what goes on? And fortunately, I met the most friendly pilots and they said, look, why don't you stay in and watch us land? And I got to see a great British Airways plane come and land into Oslo Airport. The awe of flight still amazes many of us, to think that it's really just over 100 or a bit over 100 years old that we now are able to travel the globe and do the most amazing things. Trevor Jensen's our guest speaker today. And Trevor's a consummate aviation expert, having devoted his career to safe flying and leadership of airlines in Australia, including Qantas and Ansett, home of my little wings. He's also been a leader of airlines in Europe and in the Asia Pacific region. He's also been on the board of the Royal Flying Doctors Service. In recent years, he's consulted extensively on airline safety and strategies to restaff and reposition airlines for post-pandemic airline operations. Today, Trevor is going to share with us his extensive experience in civil aviation and give us an understanding of what we can look forward to in our future flight experiences. Please give a very warm Rotary Melbourne welcome to Trevor Jensen.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Chairman Reg. It's a great honour and great pleasure. I was having a quiet coffee down in Paran when I was talking to Reg about some thoughts on aviation, and suddenly I'm here. So it's a good idea to keep your mouth shut sometimes and not express. But what I'd like to talk about today, really, is so much in aviation. Aviation is just a wonderful story, amazing story. But what I'd like to Thank you. What I'd like just to focus on really is one of the more interesting thoughts, and that is as we move towards the possibility of pilotless aircraft. Now, I started my career in the union, so I've been on both sides, both in management and the union, and I have a son who's a captain in Jetstar, who really has great difficulty with me when I talk about this, because he said, it was good for you, Dad. You had a great career, now you're trying to wipe mine out. But nevertheless, I think it's an interesting subject, and I'd like just to touch on a few issues as we go forward. So I think Joe's going to change the slides. Is that correct? Otherwise, it doesn't really matter if I could stay on. One of the things I'd like to do is, first of all, acknowledge the traditional landholders. But in doing so, it's a bit more than that. One of the things we probably forget sometimes that 10,000 years ago, the Aboriginals developed the first aerofoil, the boomerang. And the mathematics of that is the mathematics of that wing below and of every wing in every aircraft. So sometimes we sort of go through very quickly and just acknowledge our traditional landowners and just pass on. But there are some tremendous stories, and that's certainly one that I love. Next thing, of course, was Joe. The first pilot, we believe, was Pontius, but he didn't really fly. So it was left for the Wright brothers to be the first guys to jump in and be commanders of a powered aircraft. Now, they were pretty thoughtful, obviously, because one of the issues we deal with in aviation today on long-range flying particularly is fatigue. And as you can see, they started out pretty early by having the pilot in a prone position. So sadly, we moved away from that as we got smarter. But I think, as Warren Buffett said, of course, as we know about aviation, it was a pity that there wasn't somebody there with a shotgun that day and a box of matches, because by shooting both the Wright brothers and burning the aircraft, we could have saved the aviation industry a lot of money, because it certainly doesn't always produce the greatest of returns. So as we moved away from that, more and more of the aircraft became complicated and complex with the old style technology. And eventually we got to the point where you had pilots, flight engineers, navigators, and radio operators. And I only ever did one flight in my whole career where we had the whole spectrum. We had 3 pilots on the front of the aircraft, on a 707 it was, and we had a navigator, a flight engineer, and a radio operator. So I only had one sector. So bit by bit, the bottles began to fall. And first of all, the pilots could work the radios, so they got the job of working the radios. And then we were also taught to navigate as sort of new, better navigation equipment. And of course, today, you can fly around the world on your phone. And that's there's more technology in this than what the boys had when they went to the moon. So it's quite amazing. So again, navigation was passed across to the pilots. And then as the aircraft developed, so the flight engineer, who was one of the great characters on the aircraft always, and someone we always enjoyed to fly with, they were removed as well. There was a school of thought at one stage that we would get down to a pilot and a dog. And the idea there being that the pilot would fly, and the pilot would feed the dog rather, and the dog would bite the pilot if he attempted to touch the aircraft in any way. But we passed that. So my poor little poodle never got to wear the 4 gold bars. But we've moved on today, as we know, with the drones. They're not always used in the peaceful way that we hope for the future, but certainly the drones today are being flown all around the world, and the operators are sitting somewhere in America and they're over Afghanistan carrying out attacks. Now, there is no reason why civil aviation follows the military. I remember being at a speech in London, probably back around 1982 or a bit earlier, and there was a guy there talking about the fact that we will be able to, we won't need to look outside the aircraft to land. Well, he said, it's only a matter, all we've got to wait for is the Russians to pinch the technology off the Brits, and then the whole world can have it. And so as we've gone along today with head-up displays and things like that, all the pilots have got on board the aircraft, we do move along quickly. So again, I think we'll follow the technology is developed around the drone, and we'll move forward. What was, of course, interesting, the first drone accident that they had to investigate was in the US. And but they were out chasing the drug runners and with a drone. And there was two guys, a pilot with his computer and the operator who worked with the guy on the ground. Well, the pilot got them to the area, handed over to the operator. When they came time to hand back, of course, the computer locked up and the drone crashed. And so we have those lockups, not so much these days, but lockups with the computers to show you that how technology has to improve in lots of ways as we go forward. So along the way, the US, particularly the US pilots and the European pilots got together, and this little document that I show on the screen there in the corner was produced back in the late 70s, and it sort of presented the case as to why you had to have a minimum of 3 pilots on the flight deck. The argument being was that aviation numbers would increase. There was so much to monitor on board the aircraft that it couldn't possibly be done by less than 3 people, and that safety would be impacted. Well, at about the same time, as we saw on the previous slide, we started to reduce to 2 pilots, but the safety record has improved because technology has moved along with the support systems. The weakness, again, always will be the human being. 80% of all accidents today are human failure. And that's the one thing that we can't address. If you go back to around the 1950s, most of the problems then were technical, with the aircraft breaking, bits falling off, engines failing, etc. But they fixed all that as we've gone along, and now it's us poor humans that will fail, and we all make mistakes. There's nobody that I'm aware of that's got away without it. As we sort of move into the next slide that comes up, it shows you an idea of the concept of what they would do, and that possibly the next thing you'll do is move from 2 pilots to 1 pilot. And when we do that, now I should make a point here, I am not promoting no pilots or a single pilot. This is just something that everybody has to discuss and think about. So I'm not here as the promoter of the no pilot flight deck. But what you would do is you'd have a pilot, somebody on board the aircraft, and then a remote pilot on the ground to support in the critical sections of the flight. And what's very interesting on this one is sort of James would certainly know as well that about 85–90% of our accidents happen during climb and descent. And during cruise, very rare for events to happen in cruise. You know, the example one was the shooting down of the Malaysian aircraft in cruise. Now, that is a pretty rare event, and it wouldn't matter whether you had 25,000 pilots on board, a rocket's still going to take you out. But this was sort of what it would look like, so it sort of makes sense. But the next real question is that if we do start to reduce the pilots, thanks, Joe, that what are we going to do? How do we help him? And we've got a tremendous resource on board the aircraft, and it's called our flight attendants. And this is what I wanted to sort of in some ways focus on a bit today. In the one of the reasons why we'll be slow in moving towards a reduced flight deck will be public acceptance. Nothing more. People will travel around now. In China, they've got trains that are driverless. The French are working now to a driverless train, and the Docklands train, I think, in London is driverless. But in both the French and the British case, they do have a person on board in case something goes wrong. So what we can think about is that if we did decide to go to, say, to a single pilot initially, how do we use the flight attendants? Because if the pilot needs help, you've got all these people outside. Now, the flight attendants aren't on board just to be nice. They're on there for a very important safety reason. The fact that they serve us meals and look after us, that is their secondary role, not their primary role. So what you can start to do is, if we were to reduce it, to use our resources wisely, why wouldn't we use the cabin crew? But of course, cabin crew and pilots are very different. Pilots are boring old farts, to use a French word or French phrase. When they're flying along in flight, they'll sit there and they talk about sex, seniority, and salary. Flight attendants, they get out there and work. When you get on the ground, the pilots, all they want to talk about is flying, as I'm doing today. And so that's a different profile, a recruiting profile. Pilots are very technical, cabin crew are people orientated. So if we start to want to use these people and expect them to come into some role, how do we still select the same people, or do we need to start to think about the selection processes? Will we be looking for a different type of person? Of course, the obvious argument is, well, if you're going to now train flight attendants to be pilots, why take the pilot off in the first place? So, but what we're looking at is what could we do? And if we're going to think that way, we have to start to get an industry and a group of people looking at, besides thinking about what we can do when we reduce the pilot numbers. Now, Air France, I beg your pardon, not Air France, I mean Airbus, they've been flying these aircraft around without the pilots on them for about the last 3 years in trials. So there's a lot of work going on. So they're in the position where if the industry wanted to move to a reduced cockpit complement, they can move fairly quickly. Boeing, of course, is following along the same lines. And it's there. Airlines exist for two reasons. One is to carry people. Two is to make money for the shareholders. And as I said at the beginning, they're not very successful sometimes in doing the latter. But so you can expect that the pressure will come on from the management side of the industry to look to a reduction in crew at some stage. We've seen it as the bottles have fallen. Radio operators, navigators, flight engineers, and slowly we'll move into the pilots. So we can look to this now. If we're going to go down this path, of course, the other things we have to start to think about is in the selection, not only in the selection process, and about what authority will people have. At the moment, only one person on the aircraft has any authority, and that is the pilot in command. Now, in the legislation, there is no such a thing as a captain. It's pilot in command. Captain is the honorific title, which the guy who is the pilot in command carries throughout the industry. But if you read all of the legislation from the International Civil Aviation Authority, who's the masters, it's about the pilot in command. There are very few references, for example, to the co-pilot. All it says is the co-pilot will be a person who helps the pilot in command. There's nothing about flight attendants. So we're going to have to, and when you deal with IATA, or with ICAO, I beg your pardon, remember they're part of the United Nations. Now, if you want to get a meeting, what you do is you let them know you want to have a meeting. So they form a committee, which says these people want to have a meeting. So then they said, well, we'll meet next year. And when you meet next year, they say, what are you going to discuss? Oh, so fine. So then they'll meet the following year to talk about that discussion. And then the following year, well, basically it takes 5 years. And of course, if you don't get the process right, nothing happens. And I'll give you a good example. When we were in the late 80s, early 90s, we were establishing free flight between Australia and the US. In other words, instead of having to follow standard tracks, we could use the wind and the weather of the day, and we could actually free fly across to America. We did a tremendous amount of work with the American Airlines, with the FAA, with the Australians, with Qantas. At that time I was very heavily involved in Qantas, and we got to the stage where we're finally getting before ICAO, but the meeting didn't go. Our agenda item didn't get up. Why? You had to give every member of ICAO 120 days notice of the agenda, and they had to have the agenda papers 120 days before. Sadly, there was a country in Africa who got theirs 118 days before, and they lodged an objection. To this day, I have still to see an African airline flying on the Pacific, but we were delayed for a whole year in that process. That's how bureaucratic it is. So when we talk about changing legislation and ideas around what we might do if we reduce cabin numbers, we have to start thinking about it now. We have to start to think about what legislation changes would you want? At the moment, you depend upon your crew. And once before 9/11, if there was a problem, the one thing we were always taught, if you ever went back to the cabin was a problem, you had to wear your hat. So as soon as there was a problem, you'd put your hat on and you would go back, because that made you look as though you knew what you were doing. So I was in Singapore one day, and we were about to depart, and we had a very interesting captain. He had been born in Shanghai, and so he was the only Chinese captain we had, although he spoke with a very British voice. And but Jeff Allen was sitting there, and just as we were about to complete the boarding, we got a phone call from the flight attendants to say there'd been a problem in the cabin. So, and what it was a passenger was very, very ill. And now in those days in Singapore, if a passenger was to pass away on board the aircraft was impounded while the coroner made a determination, which he would do within 24 hours. So the skipper dispatched the first officer, a guy called Jim Dye, who'd been a V-bomber pilot, great guy, down to handle this matter. So while we're sitting there, another phone call to the flight deck, and there's a punch up down the back. So Jeff looked at me and he said, well, get your hat and away you go. So I got my hat and I trundled down to the back of the old jumbo, which used to take about 45, 50 seconds to walk down to the back. When I got to the rear galley, as I was going past Jim Dye, he was just helping this poor unfortunate bloke off the aircraft. And sadly, he passed away about a quarter of a second after he got through the door. So that wasn't going to delay our flight. So that was very fortuitous. So I got down to the rear galley and the flight attendant was there with a passenger. And I said, what's the problem? And the passenger said, that guy over there punched me when I was getting on board the aircraft, and I'm not flying on an aircraft with a violent man. So I said, all right, go and sit down. So I got this guy into the rear galley, and I said, oh, hello, how are you? I introduced myself, and I said, did you punch anybody when you were getting on the aircraft? This guy didn't speak English. And I said, oh. So I said, did you, tried to sign language, nothing worked. This guy, he said he just did not speak English. He was a Dutchman, and I had difficulty with a Dutchman not speaking English, but he didn't speak any English. So I said to him, mate, go and sit down, and if we have any trouble from you, you will be in jail when you get to Australia. Do you understand? He said, I don't speak English. So he went and sat down. So I went back to the flight deck, and the captain said, how'd it go? And I said, not a problem. Everything's resolved down the back. And as I was saying that, the phone rang, and the steward said, Captain, we've still got a problem down the back. You better send the second officer back. So I trotted down to the back. When I got down there, here's the guy who made the complaint. And I said, what's the problem? He said, it wasn't that guy that punched me. It was that bloke over there. I said, fine, you just go and sit down and we'll go on. So for the week after that, when I got home from the trip, every time the phone rang, all I could visualize was a chief pilot and saying, you better come in and there'll be no tea and bickies. If you got invited for tea and bickies, it was good. No tea and bickies was bad. I'll never forget that. So one of the things that happened on 9/11, when you couldn't go back, you immediately couldn't get into trouble. But of course, the cabin crew are still dealing with these issues, and we've got to be able to give them some authority to be able to deal with it. So if the first officers haven't got any delegated authority now, there's a lot of work to be done. And these are the sorts of issues. So just moving down, forget about all the public perception and all those sorts of issues. So the number of things we'll have to think about and need to be thinking about now if we've got any idea. And we could move to certainly the first thing you'll do is go to freighters. Why couldn't a freighter be flown around as the test beds? Because all you got on board is freight. And valuable as it is, it'd probably be like some of these big bulk carriers now when the containers go off the side, it's insurable. And so we could actually test the system with drones, with the drone aircraft, and then we can start to move forward. But if we're going to go down there, we've got to really work out what are the duties and responsibilities going to be of our captains in the future, what of the people that are on the ground. And there was a great movie of Helen Mirren's, where they did a drone strike. And I can't think of the name of it now, but it was a great movie. And the people that flew the drone were actually back in America, and they attacked in Afghanistan, and a young child was killed. And of course, all these other issues that come down. When you're on the aircraft, it's a very different situation. But when you're remote doing things, there is ethics questions and a whole lot of things. If you step aside, when you're there and you're part of it, you're part of the decision making. If you're sitting somewhere else, you can get up now and say, well, I'm going home now, and walk out. Where's the ethics? When it turns into a bit of a nightmare. So we've got to think that through. We've got to think about what sort of people will we recruit and what sort of products will we have on board the aircraft in those days. Because I can't imagine that and of course we never imagine no pilots, but I can't imagine just allowing a bunch of people get on board an aluminium tube and fly around the world, because you could imagine if somebody, fear of flying, whatever it might be, it could become quite catastrophic. But there's some of the issues that I just sort of chat about today. I know that the future of aviation is amazing. We've seen it go through COVID, and already we're watching Alan Joyce and the others come back and say that the flying has picked up to above COVID levels. So the desire to fly is going to be there. And so the industry will come back very, very rapidly, but we'll be looking for other ways in which we're going to manage the industry and get by. And certainly the idea of a reduced complement cockpit will come up, and will come up in the next couple of years, without a doubt. So thank you very much.
We've probably got some time for a few questions. So does anyone have any questions they'd like to pose to Trevor? We've just got down the back. We've got Jim down the back there.
Hi there. Just a quick one. I mean, one of the benefits of not having a pilot, I guess, there have been in the last little while a few incidents of pilots being directly the cause of accidents. So I'm not sure if that's something you'd comment on real quickly, and including the sort of maybe the recent example of the plane in China.
Okay, I think that's a very interesting question. You know, first of all, one of the great things about aviation and why it's so safe is we really investigate anything that happens. And an investigation into an aircraft accident will always take at least 12 months, and nobody assumes anything. Now, the media will come out straight away and make all the guesses in the world. But the aviation industry will wait until we've got all the facts, and then we come down with a decision. Now, with referring just to the China, well, we don't know what's happened. There's possibly, they'll be looking at a couple of possibilities. One could be a rogue pilot. One could be a runaway stab trim that's pitched the nose down. One could possibly be because the aircraft appeared to go in intact, could have been a decompression that was carried out that wasn't carried out properly. Probably not likely, but we don't know. But we have got the black box and the flight recorder. And the Chinese really have quite a good safety record. And they are also very good at doing this investigation. So we will know if those can be read. So, but with the rogue pilots, you know, 1 in 10 people in the world have got some sort of mental problem. So in this room, there are probably, 5 of us that could have an issue. With the pilots, it must also be the case, but we go through a very, very strict medical regime where you're doing your medical checks every it's about every 12 months, but when you become an old bugger, you do them every 6 months as you go along. And so you're being checked. You're also being watched. Within the cockpit, we've got cockpit resource management where we watch each other and we'll challenge each other. And you know, if the pilot's not doing what you expect, because we follow standard operating procedures so closely, when somebody deviates, and this is why successful airlines follow standard operating procedures. That's why Australia is so good. Australia really has an amazing safety record, and it's because of this discipline about following standard operating procedures. So that the minute somebody does something different, you can say, what are you doing? And also, we have, as Australians, we are not backward in challenging somebody. We're not, whereas, as we know, in Asian culture, there is face saving. It's a fact of the culture. And so there are occasions there where they're not so quick to challenge. But I think we have to acknowledge that there will be psychological problems. There's been, if you really look at aviation, and we're aware of probably, there was an Egyptian Air, I think, James, wasn't there? There was it's about five I could think of. And of course, we don't know what's happened on the Malaysian one, whether that's another issue or not. But so when you really think about 120 years of aviation and the system, yes, you can't ever rule it out, but the probability of it happening is probably lower in aviation than in a lot of other industries. For example, on the rail or something like that.
And we have one last question from Alan.
Thank you. Alan Trumbull. One of my life's exciting experiences was a flight on Concorde.
Oh.
Will we see a return of that sort of aircraft, do you think?
When I was a young lad, went through the Qantas Cadet Scheme, we were recruited actually to be Concorde pilots. That was the purpose of the Qantas Cadet Scheme. In fact, Qantas had orders for Concorde, and Alan Tyrrell was the flight captain Concordes. And a very great mate of mine, Michael Bannister, ended up being the chief pilot of Concorde in British Airways. And I think that would have been the best job anyone could have ever had in aviation, to have that on your card. But to come to the question, yes, I think you only have to be able to fly halfway around the world. And we can almost do that now with the long range flying. I'm going across to the States on Friday night to see my son and little grandson. It's an 18.5-hour flight from Singapore across. Air New Zealand's about to start Auckland to into New York, and we've got Qantas flying now from Australia to England. So we're almost at that halfway around the world. But how much faster? It's going to come back to the fact that airspace is so congested now. That's why big aircraft like the 380 play an important role. For one 380, you need 5 or 6 other aircraft. So you've got to start to think about it in terms of, is speed going to actually create a problem for us? There'll be no doubt there'll be an attempted supersonic flight. There will be, I would think there'll probably be supersonic business aircraft. I think that's where we'll go. I don't necessarily think we'll go into supersonic airliners in the future. They'll be too expensive and they won't be able to carry enough people, quite frankly. So.
That's right. Well, I think we could hear from Trevor all day. So thank you very much, Trevor, for speaking to us today. Is a show of our appreciation, and within that we have a Rotary 100 book, a commemorative coin, and also, which is always important because I always receive these when flying, as a pair of socks, and it's our R100 socks. So hopefully you can switch your Ansett and your Qantas and your other airline ones. But thank you very much, Trevor. Excellent. And for one last announcement and to close the meeting, I'd like to ask President nominee, Councillor Baxter, to come to the stage.
Thanks, Adrian, and thank you, Trevor, for a really wonderful speech. I just wanted to take a moment to talk about Ryman, which is the Rotary Inner Melbourne Relief Network, just to talk quickly about some volunteering opportunities, and we heard about the appetite for volunteering, so we have some. And also, if you're not in a position to volunteer, how you can actually help by raising a glass. So just a couple of quick things. We have, so Ryman supports relief agencies and people that have been through domestic violence, asylum seekers, refugees who are being rehomed and rehoused, and supplies secondhand donated furniture, kitchen goods, linen, crockery, everything you need to kit out an apartment or a home for those that have been homeless. We've got a warehouse in East Brunswick, and we've got volunteering opportunities during the week, Tuesday, Wednesdays and Thursdays, and also Saturdays. It doesn't have to be hands-on volunteering though. So if you, and it's not heavy lifting, I do it myself and it's not that heavy lifting, but if you don't want to attend a warehouse and do that hands-on volunteering, there's opportunities to help with the rostering, ringing up the agencies and arranging deliveries of goods and receipt of goods. So lots of opportunities there. But if you're also partial to a nice glass of wine, we have an opportunity to buy some through, it's called, let me find it, Prospect Wines. And for every case that you buy, a small value actually goes toward Ryman. And what that will do is it'll help us save up to buy a van, to be able to be masters of our own destiny and collect some of the furniture ourselves. At the moment, we're using a borrowed van and it's a little uncertain. So trying to get some control over that. So Joe did get it into notices a couple of weeks ago in the newsletter. So I just encourage you to consider that. I'll leave some of these with Joe. This has the, if you do have donated goods that you'd like to provide, there are There's an email address for that, and also if you're interested in volunteering, and also a phone number. So I'll leave that with Joe on the way out. So please do consider that. But I'd also like to say thank you everyone for attending today, particularly our MC, Sandra Hills, well done, thank you, and Peter Dakin, and our lunch setup and reception crews. Wonderful job today. And if you can spare a few minutes just after lunch to help with the breakdown of everything, that would be terrific. A reminder that next week our guest speaker is Brendan Gale, CEO of the Richmond Football Club, and speaking on the impact of Indigenous reconciliation on club performance. So bound to be a very good one. I do hope that you can join us and perhaps even invite a colleague or a friend. So now please stand and we'll close the meeting with the national anthem.